Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, myself and my co-host Riki are talking about the new Netflix movie Rebel Ridge. It's been out for a couple of months now, but it's been causing quite a stir. It is a very good movie with a lot of interesting issues that it raises, and Riki and I are going to talk about it. And this, like a lot of things recently, has been one that Riki suggested. So, Riki, let me just kind of start by giving you a chance to introduce yourself and then talking about why you want to talk about this movie.
Hey, good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Yeah, I just came across this on Netflix and wasn't really sure what it was. Read the description, I thought, okay, I'll give this a shot, and really enjoyed it. And then started to do more research into some of the stuff going on in this movie and the people behind it. And I thought it would be good. It brings up a couple of issues that I think are very good in relation to what we talk about on the show and just very relevant to our society in general. For an action movie, I think that's perfect, right?
Yeah.
Most action movies we think of as mindless, but this one just really makes you think, and I enjoyed that a lot about it.
Yeah, it really does on a couple of levels because first of all, I will say, and as someone who's on record as not being a huge fan of fight scenes, the fight scenes in this are incredibly beautifully shot. I think I don't have the problem I often do of not being sure what's going on. I always know what's going on. But also there are times where the action scenes don't give you what you think you're going to get. And that has a lot to do with how the like that visual storytelling is explaining our protagonist's perspective on violence, which is what we're going to a part of what we're going to be talking about. For those who haven't seen it yet, I'm going to give a brief summary. I'm going to avoid kind of some spoilers till the end. Well, yeah, let me start again. For those who haven't seen it, I would recommend hitting pause and then going to watch it because we are going to have to spoil a bunch of things. I'll try not to spoil the very end, but we probably will eventually. But let me kind of give a plot rundown for those who aren't going to see it or those who saw it a little while ago and forgotten it. And again, I recommend going to see it, but either way, here it is. So the movie, sorry, I had names right here. So our protagonist is a guy named Terry Richmond, and his cousin Mike is in jail and is about to get transferred to state prison while he is awaiting trial. The problem with all this is that Mike has, it is a legit bust. He was caught with drugs planning to distribute, but he had earlier been a witness to another crime. He's supposed to be getting some kind of witness protection or something. He's not, and if he's sent to state prison, he's going to be killed. So Terry, our protagonist, is riding his bike, trying to bring the bail money to the courthouse in this small town of Silver Springs, I think it's called. It's never said that it's in Louisiana, but it's the accents are of that area, and they constantly are talking about parishes instead of counties. So I think this is Louisiana, but either way, it's definitely the deep South. And Terry gets Terry has an altercation with the police while he's on his bike. They search him, they find the cash, and because he is connected to Mike, who was arrested for drug charges, they assume that, well, they make the claim that the money is something that the police should be able to take under what is called civil forfeiture, civil asset forfeiture, something we're definitely going to talk about a lot, and basically take the money. And then a lot of the rest of the movie is about Terry first trying legal avenues and then extra legal avenues to get that money back in order to protect his cousin Mike by bailing him out of jail. Eventually, he fails in that. Mike is taken to jail and Mike dies in jail as was expected. And now the fight is about getting justice and about trying to bring light to the terrible corruption that's happening, because they find out that there's actually been this because they find out that this has been a pattern for some time, that the sheriff, who is clearly racist, clearly corrupt, but they can't be, as clearly upfront about that kind of stuff as they might have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so now it has to be a lot more under the radar through these bureaucracies, through the civil asset forfeiture. And so Terry tries to deal with this. He gets into a couple of altercations where one thing we learn is that he is a former Marine, and he taught de-escalation. He taught people how to not let fights escalate, but both verbally and also physical actions that are focused on ending a fight, not necessarily winning it in terms of knocking the other guy out or shooting them. But it's a lot of like disarming people or knocking them down or incapacitating them without aiming to kill them. Although importantly, the phrase that's used is less lethal violence. They don't talk about non-lethal violence, and we'll definitely get to that. And so a number of things happen through the course of the movie. He gets help from a couple of folks, including a court assistant named Summer and another police officer who turns out has kind of been a mole trying to feed information to people about what's happening in the police department. And then in the kind of climactic scene, yep, I was wrong, which can kind of spoil the ending already. He's in a chase. They're trying to get to the hospital. So because he needs a hospital, they're trying to get to a hospital because the cop who helped them needs a hospital, but also because he needs to, get the information that he's got on the secret drive to the right authorities. And one of the cops winds up helping them in large part because he's able to kind of make the case of, look, you guys are all going to go to jail. This is all super corrupt. And so in the end, the cops all wind up helping him to take down their boss. But it's left pretty murky as to whether the cops had this, oh, he's in the moral right, we're in the moral wrong moment, or just, oh, wait, our boss is going down, we want to cover our own asses. And kind of one of my favorite parts of the movie that's left intentionally vague. And the writer, director, and editor has said they left that intentionally vague. So that's kind of a quick summary of the movie. Riki, what did I leave out?
Well, let's talk about the creator. It's Jeremy Saulnier. I'm giving it a little French twist. Who is, I believe, most famous for the movie Green Room, which was a 2015 movie about a punk band who plays a show at a Nazi bar and then gets into an altercation, and then they have to fight their way out of the titular Green Room against a bunch of Nazis, including Patrick Stewart. So it's pretty well known for that kind of cameo or stunt casting, and is well regarded as like another movie in this department of an action movie with some interesting things to say about society. Yeah. And this was 2015 when, the idea of a Nazi bar was like an underground place and not just that place down the street.
Right.
So I really like his work, Jeremy Saulnier, and I'm curious to explore more after this and learning that he did Green Room.
Mm-hmm.
As for the story, I think you covered it well. My biggest thing about this was that it's obvious that Terry is the protagonist, the hero of this action movie.
Right.
And the cops, and especially the sheriff, played by Don Johnson, the delightful casting, it's clear that they are bad, like they're doing bad things, but it is never done in a way that is, like we would say, mustache twirling, like comic book villain. They're definitely bad. They're doing, and sometimes even evil, like I might say, but you can always kind of see the humanity.
Yeah.
And go like, I understand what they're doing, and it's not out of the realm of reality. Like I know, like I read that this is not based on a true story, but it is based on facts and situations that have happened to people, not to the action movie degree, but the civil asset forfeiture, which we'll talk about more later. It's like definitely something that happens.
I think that's so true. And I think the fact that fairly early on, Terry admits Mike did commit the crime for which he was arrested is really important in that. Because, like, to be clear, there are people in jail, especially people of color, men of color, black men, who did nothing, who were completely framed. But a lot of these things happen because someone makes a dumb mistake and then things escalate and get much worse because of this, or because their family members are trying to navigate the system of, okay, my family member's going to jail, I get it, but how do I help them? How do I get money to them in the commissary? How do I help keep them in, witness protection or something like that? And yeah, I totally agree. It keeps it very human. You understand the pressure that's under, that the cops are under. That part of the issue is that there's a consent decree in place. Because of like basically this is a police department that did commit acts of racist violence or something like that in the past. And I think there's a wrongful death suit against them. And so they're out of money. And so they need more money to do this. And again, it's not like making them heroes by any means. It's because of their own, awful practices this has happened. But that makes the Don Johnson character feel a lot more, like a person, like a real character who I could see in real life, rather than like, mwahaha, I just want to have, diamond plated, everything in my cop mansion kind of a thing.
Yeah, the comical thing that he corruptly spent money on was a margarita machine,
Yeah.
right? And they are also stockpiling weapons, which I would argue, like the amount of weapons that they have are not necessary for this size police force, like for this jurisdiction. But I can understand like the mentality of the police force saying like we want more stuff.
Right. Well, and the fact is that most police departments now have far more. I mean, you could argue like, do any police departments need tanks, or which
Sure, the tanks.
they don't have
And
quite that level, but like, yeah, just like the level of weaponry that this police department has is way out of proportion to what you would think they'd need. But it's also not unrealistic to what's happening in our own world.
yeah, like when they first show the armory and pan to it, I was like, that's a lot for like I don't like a dozen people.
Uh huh.
But I do there's a theme, you mentioned less lethal, and I
Mm-hmm.
think it was actually Don Johnson's character who was commenting on the weapons they have. And he said, "Well, we've had to like shift to buying non-lethal weapons, or as they want us to call it, less lethal because of like legal issues."
Right.
So I think that was a really good line for like developing the plot and showing what's happening and why later on Terry uses a bunch of these weapons and does not kill
Mm-hmm.
people, but also like the idea of rubber bullets, or they have a shotgun that shoots sandbags,
Right.
right? And there have been deaths that have occurred in
Yeah.
situations where people have used police forces have used these weapons on civilians, tasers as well. Like there have been deaths from tasers.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the acknowledgement that they are not universally non-lethal, but they are less lethal is good.
Yeah. Honestly, this is the language that I've been wanting every time we talk about Daredevil or Batman or any kind of hero who, makes the claim of I won't kill. And I'll save a lot of that for we're gonna do a whole episode on nonviolence and non-lethal violence and things like that. But part of it is because I, you can kick a person in the head and kill them. You can punch a person in the stomach, and just because of a freak thing, you can kill them. Like the idea that there is a clear line of this violence is lethal and this violence absolutely is not is nonsense. And I just love that they show him doing everything he can to avoid lethal violence. But I think he's going into it knowing that, yeah, like there's a couple times where he knocks people down and they hit their heads.
Some of the action sequences, especially from Terry's actions, are very brutal.
Yeah.
And so, like, I would caution people, like, if you're going to watch it, be aware of that. We're talking about less lethal, but at one point, he breaks a man's arm, and another man, he like punches, he's got him on the ground and he punches him in the face multiple times.
Yeah.
Um, and
Like,
it's clear, like, from the narrative, like his training, like, he knows how to apply force in a way to incapacitate people. And
right.
that's what he's trying to do. But I agree, like, it's very possible, like, from those face punches that like a person could die in that situation.
Yeah, for sure. And I just really appreciate that. And so let's talk about his whole theory let's talk about this left lethal. Let's talk about this left. Let's talk about this less lethal violence. That's a hard thing to say. Kind of philosophy he has, because it's clear that he is not only in how he fights, but just everything he does. His goal is de-escalation. How did that strike you? Because it's not what we normally see from heroes.
Yeah, I enjoyed watching, like, when the action sequences start, he is always doing things like very deliberately. In the very first like physical confrontation, he takes the sheriff's pistol. Like the sheriff like unholsters his pistol and is getting ready to use it, or at least
Mm-hmm.
threaten Terry with it. And Terry, disarms him. and then very quickly empties the magazine,
Yeah.
and then turns the sheriff around because like his deputies are coming out with their weapons, and he turns the sheriff around, uses him as a shield, and
Hmm.
walks him forward and is talking to the deputy saying like, hey, you don't want to do this, like you don't want to do this, let's
Right.
talk about this. Like the language he uses, right, is part of the de-escalation. He's disarmed the sheriff, he's eliminated that as a lethal weapon in this situation, and throughout the action sequences he's constantly doing that. Like in a later action sequence he picks up a shotgun and
Right.
empties all the shells, and one of the police officers later picks up that shotgun in the conflict, in the confusion, and tries to shoot Terry, and it's empty because he had taken
Right.
care of that issue.
Yeah. No, it's so well done. And I was reading an article about the movie about how some folks had said that they were kind of disappointed that he doesn't kill the cops, the corrupt cops at the end of the
uh,
movie. And the director talked about this, and the writer, the, Jeremy was first name, right?
yeah, Saulnier.
Saulnier talked about this and said that he wanted this movie to feel realistic, and that the chance of him killing a cop, no matter how corrupt that cop might have been, and getting away with it in this world is just not a believable thing right now. And and he also wanted to focus on how a large part of this guy's goal wasn't just like getting justice in this pure sense, it was survival. It was getting
Mm,
to a place that he could walk away and get back to some semblance of his life. First, could he survive and save his cousin? And then could he just survive? And I really liked that. And it felt like it fit this idea of the non lethality because, and this is kind of the unspoken part, but an essential part of understanding the interactions between police and men of color, but especially black men, is this assumption of lethality. And it feels like to me part of what's happening with his character is that he is especially eager to show the cops he is not going to try and use lethal violence, because the fact is that like black men doing almost anything can be assumed to be a source of lethal violence by the cops, which is then turned into violence against them in racist ways. Like I'm not saying any of that's justified. I'm saying that's what happens. And even from the very start, when he's on his bicycle, he's just trying to explain the situation, but very quickly the cops go into we're going to treat you as an adversary, we're going to treat you as a possible threat. And I think that's the motivation, that's the world in which he is living this whole movie, and why his nonviolent, his less lethal violence and his de-escalation become so vital to who he is.
yeah, there's a scene where he's driving a truck and they pull him over, and the officer, comes to the window, and I think Terry says something like, are my hands okay?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Do you remember that scene?
Yep.
And the officer says, yep, like 10 and 2. And that spoke volumes to me, right? Like that is the understanding between those two characters of like a negotiation,
Yeah.
because in those situations, and of course like they know who this guy is already, but in a situation where a police officer pulls over a black man, like
Mm-hmm.
so often we hear these terrible tragedies of a shooting in that situation because like of these assumptions and like the feeling of threat.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, I got my hands on the wheel in 10 and 2. You can see them. I'm not going for a weapon. Don't shoot me, because in so many tragic situations that happens.
Yeah.
Like even like someone reaching for, their ID and insurance and registration in the glove compartment. It's like the officer's like, I thought he was going for a gun, right? But that's
Yeah.
a normal thing. And like I don't think about, like I think about it now, but
Mm-hmm.
when I've been pulled over, I haven't ever worried about that. And that's like the tragedy of society today, and
Yeah,
of racism in society. And just the way that they showed that so subtly in that situation without ever, I think, like saying anything specifically about it, but like once you know about it, it's like, oh yeah, like I can feel this tension.
for sure. And I'm the same way. It was one thing watching this movie. It occurred to me that about a month ago, I had gotten pulled over. My car's in really bad shape. I've talked about this, and cop wanted, I think I had a headlight out or something. And literally, as he's walking up to the window, I, reach over to my coat on the other side of the in the passenger seat to grab my wallet to show him my ID, and didn't think about it the slightest. And then later, kind of driving away, and then later, like watching this movie, I was thinking about that again and thinking, I probably looked like I was darting into the passenger seat right in the moment that the cop came up to my window.
Yeah.
Maybe this cop was just not worried the way a lot of others are, but probably if I had not been a clearly white person, I don't know if that situation would have gone the way it did. So yeah, so it's just there's so many things about this movie that make you kind of just think about what are the things you don't have to deal with on a daily basis,
Or do, if
or
you
do, yeah,
are.
sure,
And I thought, like, as an Asian man, like Japanese person, I was really intrigued by the Asian characters in this movie.
Mm,
So Terry gets part of his money from, like, he had an investment in a Chinese restaurant in his
right,
hometown run by Mr. Liu, and he got, like, bought out of his investment and got the cash from Mr. Liu. As he also sold his car to go bail out his cousin.
right,
And Mr. Liu is kind of like a background character. He calls him a couple times. The first time he calls him and is like, I need more money, unfortunately. And it's like, yeah, sure, whatever you need, like, I'll send it. So, like, that relationship,
right,
like, right there, you immediately get, like, how close they are.
right,
Because it's not like, what do you like? He does sound a little surprised, but it's like, yeah, whatever you need, Terry.
right.
Like $10,000, sure. But I also found it funny that the first time he calls, Mr. Liu puts on like a stronger Asian accent.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second time Terry calls, he's speaking like, still has a bit of an accent, as you do, but is speaking more normally, I would say,
Yeah,
without the exaggerated accent. And Terry comments on it. He's like, "Oh, like you're dropping the accent now." um, But then later on, when Terry is injured, he goes to get his wound fixed up
mm-hmm.
because Mr. Liu, it turns out, was a field medic in the Korean War.
Yeah,
And the character of Summer, when she hears that, says, "Thank you for your service." And then they, like, all of them look at each other. Terry
right,
says, "Mr. Liu is Chinese. He was fighting for the other side."
yeah. It's such a beautiful moment, and everything about that relationship I love. Because Summer is part of Summer's character is that she is very much kind of like she's younger, she's white, and I think there's supposed to be kind of she both knows a lot more about the legal system than Terry does, but she's also pretty naive about the world in a lot of ways. And I think that moment is a big part of illustrating it. And there's another part of the Mr. Liu story
But
that
if I can finish this thought on that scene,
I'll
her
go for it.
reaction is also, I thought, very good. She says, "Well, I guess it's good that we can, like, meet in the middle," or something along those lines. Like, we're all
Yeah,
on the same page now.
yeah, yeah, very much so. Because yeah, he whatever he was doing in he conscript in I think we can do that. He fought for his country in that war, and then eventually he came to this country and is working here. And it's not like this movie is primarily about anti-black racism, but if you want to get reminded that anti-Sino and anti-Asian racism in general, but specifically anti-Sino racism, anti-Chinese racism is such a big thing. Just listen to the conversations about TikTok and all of the like, oh my God, the big bad evil Chinese are coming to get TikTok. There's an awful lot of racism tied into a lot of how that's discussed. And I just love the way that it's so subtly pointed at, but is a part of this movie. As well as because there's one other interaction they have where I think the second time or maybe the third time that he calls Mr. Liu, and Mr. Liu is upset at him, but quickly he realizes he's just upset, and Terry's kind of there because these cops are just anybody who is connected to somebody. Like if you get one person who they can arrest as being suspicious of drugs, now they can draw this network, and that anyone who's in any way passing money back and forth, well, that money might be drug money, because they find out that Mr. Liu had wired money to Terry, And so now there's a police raid on Mr. Liu's restaurant, and some of his assets may get seized. And I think that gets cleared up eventually. But I just thought it was such another brilliant way of saying, oh, yeah, the cops recognize here's another vulnerable person. Here's an immigrant, a Chinese person, an Asian person who doesn't really understand these things. So maybe we can seize their assets too, or at least throw the fear of God into them so they stop helping.
Yeah, Liu is an ally to Terry, like
Right,
in the most literal sense in this movie, and he is punished for it, right? And that's what you're saying, is that the racism here isn't just white cops going after a black man,
right,
but to break down this network of allyship, to break down people who want to help each other even though they're not the same, and say, no, like, don't help him. Like, if you help him, you're going to get in trouble too. And you don't want
right.
that. And this is kind of, it plays into um, the idea of, gosh, I'm blanking on the term, like the good immigrant.
Oh, the model minority.
Yes. Thank you. The model minority, like Asians in America, there's this myth of the model minority that Asians are the good ones. And
Right,
that if only everyone were more like Asians, like look at how well they do in school and businesses and such. And that is part of this trap, I guess, to stop Asians from identifying as minorities and helping black
right.
people or, Muslims, in this country.
Yeah, so much of the attempts to get rid of DEI and any kind of affirmative action or anything like that in universities and high schools specifically, they often aim a lot of it at at Asian parents, trying to frame it as like, oh, but your kids are getting punished the same way white kids are, and,
Yeah,
and that's a
the
whole other can of
affirmative
worms.
action case with Harvard
Yeah, exactly.
was the case was brought forth by Asian families.
Hmm.
But it was like white lawyers and white like interest groups that
Right.
funded those.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and I think we're left to wonder, like, if Terry had worked for a white businessman and it like co-owned a diner or something like that with a white businessman, and then that businessman had helped support him and sent him money, I don't think the cops go after him in the same way they do Mr. Liu. They might, depending on who he was, but if he has
Yeah,
Jewish last
but
name,
I think like I believe it's a deliberate part of the storytelling
very much
that
so.
it's a Chinese restaurant.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Well, and so let's talk more about this idea of civil asset forfeiture, because
Oh,
if you watch movies about racist cops in, you know, especially the 80s, 90s, 2000s, but even pretty recently, like often the cops would just be like, "Oh, you got a lot of money. I'm just going to put it in my back pocket and just write up that you didn't have any money and call you a liar." Here though, they're using this bureaucracy of civil asset forfeiture. Tell us more about that.
so there's a couple of things going on here. There's the concept of criminal asset forfeiture, which is that if you are convicted of a crime, the police or the Department of Justice or whoever can seize your assets.
Right.
And especially if they are related to the crime, right? And I think that makes sense. I'm sure there are ways that can be fudged and misused, but I think we all understand the concept. Like, okay, like you committed a crime and like these things were used for the crime or were gained from crime,
Right.
then we're going to take them from you. That makes sense. Civil asset forfeiture, which is what happens in this movie, right? Terry is not convicted of a crime. They let him go. He's not even really accused of a crime. They just say like, oh well, like you mentioned drugs, like you mentioned your cousin was dealing drugs, so this could be drug money. So we're
Right.
gonna take it, and that's it.
Yeah, that's all they need.
And like, yeah, we can say like part of it is that he's black, right?
Hmm.
That he's a black man. So like that's part of the big picture. But it's just like this can happen to anyone. And when Terry is talking to Summer, the legal clerk, he says, "Is this legal?" And she says, "Well, it's the law,"
Yeah, it's such a
which
great
is
distinction.
clever phrasing. And when I was looking it up, a lot of states have eliminated civil asset forfeiture as a law. And I
Hmm.
think more and more are doing so. And this movie bringing this issue to light in this way, in a popular Netflix movie, I think is going hopefully will help,
Right.
bring it to light, have discussions like this one where people go, what the heck? Like
Yeah.
they can just do this?
And my understanding is it was originally designed as, because if you ever seen a mob movie or something like that, where there's the like, oh, well, we have to get married now because then I can sign over my assets to you as my wife, and then they can't go after them. And there were folks who were using methods like that to get around criminal asset forfeiture. And my understanding is there may have been some like good intentions behind creating civil asset forfeiture, but it is just so easily abused and so easily, because you don't have to go through any trial process. All you have to do is say, I suspect this. And particularly when it comes to drugs, anything that is touched by that in any way, you know, there have been so many cases, for example, of, people who live with their parents or often their grandparents. And, your grandchild is caught with a very low level drug offense, not anything violent, not anything like, beyond just like a little bit of like dealing at their school or something like that, as a fellow student or, dealing on the street, and grandma can lose her house. Like, and that happens all the time. And yeah, if I told you this is a movie about civil asset forfeiture and fighting that process, you think it sounds like the most boring bureaucratic thing in the world. But he manages to make this really exciting movie that also highlights how, instead of it being just purely illegal, but where the cops who doesn't care, it's like, okay, well, the cops are now looking at us. We are under some degree of scrutiny. So we have to use these legal loopholes and bureaucracy. And I thought that was such a powerful part of the movie.
Mm-hmm. And the negotiations that happen kind of in the first half of the movie between Terry and the sheriff about the assets and like, well, can I get, this much back?
Right.
Those are real things that happen that the police forces will negotiate and be like, you can have some of it back, like half of it, let's say, for example. And basically, like, you feel lucky to get that back.
Right.
Because the problem here is like once they have it, in order for you to get it back through legal means, you have to go through the entire process of the court process, like hire a lawyer. And meanwhile, like you don't have those assets for like if you're a business owner or something.
Right.
So that's how they get you is they say, well, like it could take, 12 months and X legal fees for you to get it back fully, which, we fully believe that you would win
Right.
in a court case. But how about instead, like we just 50-50 it, right?
Right.
And again, a lot of people don't have the means or the time. And they're just like, okay, yeah, I'll take that deal.
And part of where that also gets confusing is, like, I think there is some legal justification for a deal like that. But if you think about it, like I watched that first negotiation scene and they were planning it and the cop winds up double crossing him anyway. But I thought that the minute the guy said, okay, how about if you get to keep this amount and I get to keep this amount, that the cop was then going to turn around and say, oh, well, you just tried to bribe an officer of the law, son. Now I have to arrest you. And I say son because the officer uses that exact language many times. Because that's again a thing of like, are you now saying that you'll let the cops keep this amount of money? Is that a bribe to a police officer? Like, there's just so many legal hurdles that you have to go through that, of course, people have no understanding of, and so they get tripped up on so easily.
Mm-hmm.
And I also want to talk about this idea of negotiation, because one thing that I really love is Terry is really trying to again and again use the system in his favor if he can. He wants to exhaust every legal option. And so one of my favorite parts of the movie is like, he goes back into the police office and they're all like, what's going on? And he sits down to report a crime. I don't know. They're all kind of playing along. Like, okay, let's see what happens here. And he says, I want to report that, this much money, $40,000 was stolen from me. And eventually the cops realize he's accusing the cops who took the money through this process of robbing him, which I think he's got a legitimate thing to do. But of course the cops realize this. And then the chief is like, no, if you continue this, I'm going to arrest you for harassing an officer, which is just one more way of Like, he is filing a completely
Mhm.
legitimate complaint. And he has a claim that he was robbed. And maybe a court would say, no, you weren't robbed. It was civil asset forfeiture. But he should be able to have that day in court. And again, they're saying, no, we're not going to even allow you to go forward with this. You can't report this as a crime. You've got to get out.
Yeah, I think he says they're gonna charge him with filing a false police report,
Yeah.
which it's a true thing. Like it's a true incident,
Yep.
but they can claim it's false. And then again, like you have to go through all the legal hurdles.
Mm-hmm. And I want to say one more thing about these legal hurdles and the way that this movie, the cops are using any connection to drugs and the fact that they might have like something over you to shut down your protest, which because they also give Summer a plot line involving this. Summer, as I said, is the young woman who's a court clerk who's kind of helping Terry. And one thing that we get revealed, one thing we learned during the movie is that she has a child. I think it's a son. And she doesn't get to see that child, in part because, and again, it's never spelled out. It's just kind of hinted at, but we understand that she had a drug problem at some point in time. And there's this kind of recurring fear of if she gets caught with anything relating to drugs, in the same way they're able to say, Terry, you're kind of like loosely affiliated with drugs, therefore we're going to take your money. In her case, they could say you're loosely affiliated with drugs again. That's going to be justification for permanently losing custody and terminating your ability to get back custody now that you're off drugs for a while, now that she's been sober for a while. And at one point, the
Yeah.
cops go so far as to like physically like hold her down and inject heroin into her as a way, because now she can't pass a drug test. And
Yeah.
and so she'll and it's, again, that's used as the threat to hold over her, is you're caught in this drug system and no one will listen when you say it wasn't your fault. All they have to say is Summer and heroin, and congratulations, you've lost custody.
And her job.
And her job. Yeah.
Her boss, the judge, I think, played by
Mm-hmm.
James Cromwell. Some delightful casting in
Yeah.
this movie. Yeah, the Summer heroin thing was kind of my least favorite part
Mm-hmm.
or storyline in this, because it felt a little damsel in distress when she calls Terry up and is like, I'm in
Mm-hmm.
trouble, because he was gonna leave, right?
Right.
He was done with this, and this is like pretty much the halfway point of the movie. His cousin unfortunately dies from like a beating he receives in prison from the drug
Mm-hmm.
people. They fly him in a chopper to the hospital. He dies in the hospital or on the way, and the sheriff actually, I don't know if he says I'm sorry, probably does, but gives Terry his money back. It's like a, you know, I hope this makes us square. Like, I'm sorry your cousin died. Like,
Right.
we should have listened to you. Um, Here's your money. Let's just call it even, which is terrible, right? Like, that's not, a human life is not worth $40,000. But I found that to be a very compelling scene for the sheriff character, for
Mm-hmm.
Don Johnson, and the acting in that scene is superb, because
Yeah.
I really felt like this is not what he wanted, right? Like he's just looking to make a buck.
Yeah.
He didn't want anyone to die.
And
And
I think what makes the scene so compelling is that he has two conflicting motivations, but he feels them both. And it's a reminder that people can do this, which is that I agree with you. I think he is genuinely sorry that this guy got killed, and genuinely sorry that he didn't pay attention when the guy said that his cousin was in danger. But I also think that another instance of someone who was in the custody of this police department dying uh, through neglect on their part, like that's the whole reason that he's under supervision to begin with. And he does
yeah,
kind of say to Terry, "We're square," which means you're never going to bring this up again.
yes,
And I just
he's
thought that was,
dodging accountability for sure.
yeah, he's dodging accountability. He's trying to buy Terry's silence, but he also does genuinely feel bad
Yeah,
in a way that doesn't justify him. But again, like you said, it makes him a lot more human.
yeah, and I found that really compelling, because I think a lot of people of our political affiliation spectrum have certain feelings about police, right? And the
Mhm.
way that they use the system and the violence in it. And there are statements that get made that generalize police in a very negative light. And this character is definitely a negative, but I think they did a good job of balancing his humanity in a way that, he's still the villain and we
Right.
still hate him in this movie, but it's like, yeah, like you're still a human being. And I think that was an important piece of this puzzle
Yeah.
in making this a complete picture.
And I want you to add to that, there are two other cops who kind of get to play kind of important roles. One of whom, as I said, one of whom is a cop who Terry thinks is going to be on his side, a black woman,
Yeah,
and who has said a
Sims.
kind of like they've had a couple of exchanges that indicate that she kind of is not happy with the chief's racism either. But when he thinks that that cop is on his side, she shows that no, she is still a cop. And while at the very end of the movie, she does turn on her boss, for a lot of the movie, she's not the sympathetic character to Terry that we thought she would be.
Mm-hmm.
And the cop who turns out has been kind of the mole feeding Summer information about what's happening and helping them and getting shot in the process, is a white guy. And I just thought that was a nice way of,
Not just that, but one of the two officers that confronted him initially
oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
and took his money,
Right.
which
And
is just like a completely fascinating, complex situation
yeah.
to think about.
And the fact that he was already kind of, yeah, it's like I feel like we could do a whole episode just on that one cop, because I
Because
don't
he
know.
he did a bad thing at the beginning,
Right.
right?
And
Like he stole Terry's money via civil asset forfeiture. It's the law, but he stole his money. But then, like, you look back on it, it's like, okay, but he wasn't the other guy. Like, there's another cop who was with him who is like a big asshole.
right.
And like once you can see how he's like trying to control the situation and maybe in his own way de-escalating
Right.
to just quote unquote just steal his money.
Right. And the phrase "I was just following orders," I think very correctly gets laughed out all the time, because like, no, you're supposed to know the difference between right and wrong. You're supposed to know, like, you don't go along with the Nazi orders. But if I'm a cop whose only information about the law has come from whatever cop school I went to and my sheriff, and my partner are telling me this thing called civil asset forfeiture is fully legal, I'm not sure in my head I think about the fact that I'm robbing Terry in this moment. And again, it's not to justify him, it's not to make him an angel by any means, but it further complicates his character.
In a good way.
Yeah.
In an
100%.
enjoyable way. Like it would have been so easy for this movie to just be like comically simple. And
Yeah,
it's not. And that's one of the reasons I love this movie.
agreed. And I'll just say on the Summer plot line, I agree with you that I don't like the damsel in distress place that it goes to. Though I am relieved that there's never a hint of romance between these two characters. And again, there's nothing wrong with romance,
Because
and
that was certainly something that could have happened.
definitely, and it's just refreshing that it didn't happen. In part because Summer to me feels kind of queer coded, although she has an ex-husband. Those two things don't negate each other by any means, but more importantly, just yeah, I don't like the damsel in distress plot line, but it just for me it was just nice seeing here's one more person who, because they have been touched by this thing, called drugs, that is just like this big flashing light, that she is therefore also implicated, and therefore the police feel like they have this control over her. Like, there's definitely an extent to which this happens with all crime, but I do think in that regard, the movie is also commenting on, how drugs specifically, with like mandatory minimums and all this kind of stuff, the extent to which if you're a young person of color who gets caught having done something with drugs, the penalty is in many ways, and the way you get stuck in the system, can be a lot worse than if you steal a car or something like that. Not always by any means, but just that there's that drugs adds an additional layer of horror to everything that can happen.
Mm-hmm. So, Matthew, you touched on this earlier, and I wanted to come back to it because you on this podcast have often said, that you don't like action sequences, whether it's live action or animated, when when the action's confusing. And you said that this movie did a really good job of making it clear what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of wanted to talk about that because it also kind of ties into the less lethal violence from this character.
Mm-hmm.
In that final confrontation, Terry goes up against, I think, like maybe half a dozen officers in front of the police station. There's a bunch of parked cars, and he uses the cars as like obstacles and shields, and has like shot a couple of smoke grenades to obscure vision.
Mm-hmm.
What like how did you feel in that moment? Like, you enjoyed it, right? Like, as an action sequence? Because I love that scene, and it's
Mm-hmm.
one of the best action sequences I've seen in recent memory. And I just wanted to talk about that real quick.
Yeah, I did because, like, yeah, in that scene, I didn't know exactly what was happening, but it felt like that was the point. There's one thing to have two people fighting and the director make it not clear what's happening because that's the artistry they're going for, versus in this scene where Terry is very intentionally not letting the cops know what is happening. And so the scene winds up giving the viewer that same experience.
Okay.
It felt like that there was a cause for my not understanding in a
Right.
way that really fit the narrative instead of it just looking cool.
So okay. So your confusion is mirroring the confusion of the cops.
Right,
Like,
exactly.
where are we? Like, where is Terry?
Right.
But I do think like it was shot well in a way. Like, at one point he takes one guy out and then like rolls under a car, and the camera like pans and follows him under the car to the other side
Mm-hmm.
where he like takes another guy out. Like, stuff like that I thought was shot so well. I think what you're talking about, like when action sequences do quick cuts and
Yeah.
like the shaky cam where
Yeah, it's
you
just
don't
all very
even
like
know.
frenetic energy,
Yeah, when you don't even know like who's throwing the punch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is often deliberate because they are trying to hide the fact that their actors are not, stunt people.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Because like they are trying to keep the faces in shot, but
Yeah.
then like maybe the actor is not as adept as the stunt person, like their stunt
Mhm.
double, so they can't do like the complicated sequences, so they kind of have to cut away to like a back shot, so
Right.
now it's the stunt person and they do the fancy stuff, and then they cut back to the face, etc. So
I think that's part of it, but I also I do think, because I hear that style praised a lot, and I think it becomes stylistic.
who's doing that? Get out of here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is like, not to open this can of worms, but I think Zack Snyder is someone who does it all the time, and I'm currently getting inundated with a whole bunch of Zack Snyder fans because of stuff we said about the Superman movie, and so that is often praised, but also it happens in anime. So I agree with you that it is probably a stylistic choice that happens to cover up what you're doing with actors and stunt doubles, but I do also think it happens, like, my confusion does happen in anime a lot, or even things like martial arts movies where clearly the people don't need stunt people, they're doing it mostly themselves.
But this sequence, I felt was similar to like John Wick
Yeah.
movies, where it's like long shots, like wide shots. And this is like Keanu Reeves has been praised for doing a lot of his own stunts
Mm-hmm.
and for the way that he carries himself and like carries a weapon. Like, I've seen a lot of people who are gun experts say like, yes, like this is actually how you're supposed to hold and shoot a firearm, not
Mm-hmm.
like these ridiculous like one-handed, shots where you don't have any control of the weapon.
Right.
And I felt the same thing out of Terry Richmond, Aaron Pierre as the actor who we're going to talk about a little more in the bonus section. But I felt like he was carrying a lot of this load
Yeah.
in the action sequences, probably doing a lot of his own stunts. And stuff like that pays off, I think, in a very realistic way for this.
Yeah.
So
I agree with that.
do more of that, please.
Yeah. No, I just thought the action stuff was great. Any other last thoughts you want to have on this movie before we go into that member section?
I loved it. I'll just say again, I personally am not too big of a fan of action movies these days, especially the ones that are like gun heavy and go over the top with explosions and all that. So from that perspective, I enjoyed this a lot. If you're similar to me, give this movie a try because I think it is an enjoyable action movie that it restrains itself
Yeah.
in the best ways.
I mean, in some ways, I would say that this movie is to action movies as I saw the TV Glow is to horror. And then I think both of them fit technically into that slot, but do so many things that you don't normally expect in those genres. Or maybe for me as a non-horror person with that one. Because to me, I kind of was thrown a bit when you first called this movie an action movie because I don't think about it that way. I think of it as a cop corruption movie where there are a couple of fight scenes.
Yeah.
But you're right. There is a lot more action than you might expect in that kind of genre. So, yeah, it's just it's a nice thing to check out. I definitely would suggest it.
If I were gonna give it like two genres, I would say like action thriller.
Yeah, thriller. I think is action thriller make a lot of sense. Couple other quick housekeeping things before we move on to the bonus section. First of all, as you probably have heard by now, we did our first episode of the new bonus member section that's going to be happening, where we're talking about core questions of superhero ethics. That first one was available for everyone. Going forward, they're only available for members, but it's easy to become a member. Only $5 a month, $55 a year. All the information is in the show notes. But one thing we also want to let people know is we are trying to record at the same time every week, which is noon Central Time on Thursdays, and then 5:30 p.m. Central Time on Wednesdays for the Star Wars podcast. And whether we're doing regular episodes or bonus member episodes, those recording sessions are always live streamed on YouTube. Again, it's just YouTube, like / or / whatever it is, The Ethical Panda Podcasts. You'll find it. Link is also in our show notes. Check that out. And next week, we'll be recording what will be our members-only episode, but it is live streamed for everyone, where we're talking about a simple issue that I've never brought up before, the question of who are superheroes accountable to. And we will, of course, be using Marvel's Civil War as somewhat of a jumping-off point, but talking about a lot of other stories which this question comes up of who watches the Watchers, if you want to think about it that way, or, are superheroes cops, and should they need the oversight that cops have, or are they individuals? Whatever it is, we're going to be talking about that. If you want to be in the live stream, come join us. If you want to just send us in questions or thoughts about what we're going to be talking about, send those in, Matthew at theethicalpanda.com, or any of our social media networks. Send that in. We'll talk about it on air and be happy to answer your questions and discuss your thoughts. So please become a member. Please think about getting an Audible membership or buying a lightsaber through our sponsors. Most importantly, though, we have spoken. Members, welcome back. So there's a fun connection between the actor in this and the Superman movie we were discussing a couple weeks ago. Rigi, take us away.
So Aaron Pierre, the star of Rebel Ridge, is also cast in the upcoming Lanterns TV show as your favorite Green Lantern, Jon Stewart.
Oh, I hadn't realized that. Okay, I can see him as Jon Stewart so easily.
Yeah, it's the perfect casting, in my opinion. And watching this movie just made me appreciate that idea even more. We talked a lot about the action sequences and how I felt like he was doing a lot of his own stunts and really has that physicality. And of course, like Green Lanterns have the power ring and they can like make constructs and just like shoot light beams. But it gives me hope that it will be like a more real Green Lantern depiction. and that he will have like some more physicality, some more stunt work involved in it rather than just like shooting laser beams out of your ring.
Yeah, I
And
think
and I'm just really excited.
yeah, I think I would join you there. I do think it's ironic, given the movie we just discussed, that he's basically playing a space cop, but Jon Stewart is definitely kind of the like, I'm going to do what I think is right, and, uh, be my own man kind of a guy. But it's just kind of funny that is a cop. But I think you're very right, because I think part of why I've never really connected to the Green Lantern character, I'm much more connected to uh, Jon Stewart himself, is because sometimes the thing with that ring can get kind of ridiculous when you're using the ring to, summon a giant hammer to hit somebody with, or to create a racetrack that a runaway car goes on, for just a random example I picked out of my brain. That happens in the Ryan Reynolds movie that I made myself watch a couple weeks ago, which is actually not as bad as I'd always thought it was. It's a perfectly middling superhero movie, but it's just not
No, it's
good.
bad.
I think it's perfectly middle. I think there's been a number of MCU movies that it's better than. Um,
Oh.
it is, to me, miles better than like Iron Man 2 or something like that. Um, but well, okay, that's a whole other can of worms. I can tell by the death look that Riki is giving me on camera right now. But the point being, yeah, I very much agree with you. I want Jon Stewart to feel like not a grounded hero. He's in space. He's a space cop, but a hero whose power set is somewhat understandable and doesn't feel completely unlimited. And I think this actor is going to go a long way towards doing that.
No, I want a grounded hero. And the brief bits I've read about what the show is going to be about
Uh-huh.
make me again like feel some hope that that's what we're going to get.
Okay,
Like
that's
it
even better.
the plot that's described is that so it's going to be two lanterns. Aaron Pierre is going to be Jon Stewart,
Uh-huh.
and then Kyle Chandler from Friday Night Lights is going to play Hal Jordan, who's kind of
Oh
the
my god,
original lantern.
Kyle
And
Chandler is one of my favorite actors. Friday Night
yeah,
Lights is a
and
phenomenally good show.
he's older, right? Like Hal Jordan was the character that Ryan Reynolds played, but that was the origin story. So clearly what we're getting here is older Hal Jordan
Mm-hmm.
and then young Jon Stewart, maybe like a fresh Green Lantern being mentored by Hal, and they are going on some kind of investigation in the American heartland, is what I read. So that's I'm
Interesting.
hoping for like this story where they spend a lot of time not in Green Lantern form, just like walking around a town and like investigating whatever, and having like a human show. And then when they need to defeat the villain or whatever, Green Lantern it up.
I would really love that, because because I do think of it as Space Cop. So I thought they'd be running off to the planet
Oh,
Alpha Marine all the time. And Kyle Chandler he's a great actor. He's been in a number of other things since then. I think the most prominent is that he's the cop going after the protagonist in Wolf of Wall Street, but he's been in other things. But forever he will be, to me, and I think many others, Coach Taylor. Like, that is just the role he was born to play. It's the role he plays in Friday Night Lights, and he's, among other things, a fantastically flawed mentor and coach, and he's very good at playing that role and showing the love he has for the people he's teaching, while also not being perfect at it. And so just the idea of him again playing a kind of like mentor character to a character who doesn't fully understand and has some real differences with, because in the show, understandably, a lot of the characters he coaches are young men of color, and there's some clashes there. It just sounds phenomenal, and those two castings make me really excited for it.
yeah. And Hal Jordan is a maverick, like probably literally maverick, like Top Gun,
Uh-huh.
because he's an Air Force test pilot who like is constantly being demoted or like dressed down because he breaks the rules.
Right.
And then like the same thing happens when he's a Green Lantern. Like he doesn't follow the rules. Like he thinks he knows better than everyone else. And that's really going to contrast with Jon Stewart, who is like, even when he's a veteran, he's like, we have to follow the rules. Like the prominent story in the animated Justice League
Mm-hmm.
is like he just like submits himself to a trial. And the other Justice League members like, you're Green Lantern, like you could just break out of this prison and then like come back to Earth and be okay. It's like, no, like we have to follow the rule of law. So I'm gonna
Yeah.
enjoy watching that. What do you What are you shaking your head at?
Oh, just because, I mean, like, we have to follow the rule of law assumes that the rule of law is legitimate and right and good. And the rule of
Sure.
law, among other things, means civil asset forfeiture. So to me, that's the irony of when I hear people say, like, we have to follow the law.
But I'm
I'm
just
always
telling
very,
you, like, these are what the characters are in the comics. Is
yeah,
that that's the contrast that's going to be playing out in this. And I'm sure, like, I'm not saying that Jon Stewart always follows the rule of law, but I'm saying, like, that is a core part of his character,
yeah,
especially in contrast to Hal, who's pretty much like always breaking the rules.
right. Yeah, no, I think it'll be really interesting. I'm really looking forward to it. When does that come out? I think that's next year.
Why? Probably this year, since we're in 2025 now.
Yeah, doesn't feel real.
I hope it comes out this year. I can't keep waiting for these shows, especially when it's a second season. I think we are probably going to be covering Severance on this podcast,
Mm-hmm.
but it's ridiculous to me that it's been 3 years between seasons.
Yeah. I think we may do an episode on season 1, just to kind of bring you up to speed. But we're definitely gonna do something on episode. Actually, we did an episode on season 1 of Severance, which we're probably going to rebroadcast at some point soon, and then we will do something on the full show once season 2 is out. And just checking now, this show is supposed to come out. Well, it was green light in June 2024. So I think with all the effects and stuff, it may not be to 2026, but we'll see.
It. Come on. Give me my lanterns. Give me a good live action Green Lantern DC.
I want it, but I also want them to
Because
get the text right.
The Ryan Reynolds one. Like, come on.
Here we go.
So upset. I'm so upset, Matthew.
No, that's fair. That's fair.
They made Parallax a cloud. Parallax is like such a compelling villain in the comics, and they just made him like this weird cloud.
I got nothing. I got nothing. All right. We're out. We'll talk more to you soon. We have spoken.